Welcome to the Your Data Driven podcast. If you like this podcast, be sure to visit our website at yourdatadriven.com for more useful help and advice on setting up your race car, mastering data analysis, and driving faster. Welcome to episode 13. In this episode, we're talking all things simulation. I'm delighted to welcome Danny Nowlan from ChassisSim's onto the show. Danny's software aims to help you better set up your racing car. If you've got a question about what springs to run or what to do with your damper, Danny's software can help you understand the effect on the car and also the effect on the lap time. This is an absolutely fascinating show. Pretty technical at times, but all with an aim to help you better understand what kind of tools are available to help you with your race car setup. Let's hear what Danny has to say. So welcome, Danny.
G'day, Samir. How you doing?
I'm very well. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate this. And our pre-chat beforehand, I think it's absolutely fantastic that we can get someone on from Australia. And here am I in the UK, and we can talk about all things motorsport.
Yeah, that's really, really great. And I think particularly in these difficult times, I think this is actually really, really good that we can, in a situation like this. And the great thing about motor racing is that what motor racing really brings to the party is that it's a real global village. And as a case in point, I would have to say half the ChassisSim user base, English is their second language. So yeah, sometimes I have to pinch myself a little bit that, wow, I've got people all over the world who are ChassisSim users and use this on a daily basis. And yeah, it is kind of cool that, you're in the UK, I'm speaking to you from Sydney, Australia, and that's something pretty cool.
A global village. I love that phrase. Wonderful. Okay, well, what we'll do is get you to give a bit of intro about yourself in case people don't know or not familiar with you and ChassisSim. But what I'm really keen to do is your work is to do with simulation. Mm-hmm. And that's my background, actually, professionally as well in vehicle dynamics. But it's not something that you see at a club race event, or you don't see club racing drivers do it.
Yep.
And or their teams even.
Yeah.
So what would be lovely is to get one or two takeaways about what this simulation in inverted commas is doing, because obviously all the professional teams are doing it, but why are they doing it, and what can we learn, and what can we do as a clubman to start to leverage or start to benefit from some of this stuff that I know. I'm really excited about this conversation. I know how passionate you are about it, but just framing that for a minute, just to sort of say, okay, well, because a lot of people listening may be intimidated, or they may be overwhelmed, or they may be unsure about the maths, and they may be unsure about how it all works, and they'll be concerned because simulation is not reality, and therefore it's not going to give you the exact lap time, for example, that's possible. Whilst you can correlate very nicely, and I'm sure you'll tell us how well you've done that, out of the box kind of thing, you've got to know a little bit of stuff, So
absolutely.
But even still, I think personally it can still be useful.
Yep, absolutely.
So tell us a little bit about you and ChassisSim, and then maybe we can get into those bits about the simulation.
I tell you what, Samir, you brought up, I just love that intro because you have brought up some really, really good themes that I think that not only is it a good idea to speak to, but the situation that motor racing now finds itself in, I think we need to speak to it. And I'll get to that in due course. But firstly, just a little bit of an introduction on myself, who I am, where I've come from. My background is I'm an aerospace engineer. And it's really, really interesting, like the amount, if we take a look at the upper echelons in motorsport, when we're taking a look at F1, sports cars, there's a very, very decided aerospace engineering mafia, and not just in the areas that you would think. Particularly in terms of aerodynamics and structures, but also too in terms of vehicle dynamics. Because I often say to a lot of young engineering students who aspire to be motorsport engineers, they often ask me, "So what should I do?" And I'll often say, "Actually, you know what? Do a degree in aerospace engineering, because what you get from from aerospace engineering is, because it's so highly focused on aircraft, but so many different elements have to come together in terms of structures, controls, in terms of structures, controls, flight dynamics, digital control, and a whole bunch, systems, a whole bunch of different stuff that all has to come together to make an aeroplane work. For me, I can tell you right now, without that primer, I would have been totally lost with my career in motor racing. But look, I was always one of these kids that I was either going to play around with fighter aircraft, or I was going to play around with race cars. It was always going to be one of the two. When I used to tell people that I was going to do aerospace engineering, everyone said, "So you're going to work for Qantas?" And I just said, "Well, look, quite frankly, I think water torture sounds like a more enticing proposition than working for Qantas." And so consequently,
This is a family. This is a family show, by the way. So. all the Qantas pilots have just unsubscribed now.
and look, and this is nothing against the Qantas pilots. It's just and the Qantas engineers, because because before Qantas totally outsourced its engineering, they did some really, really good stuff. But I was not going to. But I was not going to become an expert on the fatigue section of Section 432 of a 747. That was not particularly appealing. So it focused on actually fighter aircraft design, and in particular, where it focused on when I was an undergraduate, was designing was on flight control and digital dynamics. And so when I got out, I wanted to design fighter planes for a living. But then the Cold War had ended, and I was out of a job. So consequently, what I next did was I sold my soul to the devil. I ran away and joined the circus, and I've been doing motor racing ever since. And because my background was flight dynamics and digital, my background was flight dynamics and digital control, I was obviously looking for somewhere to apply that. And so I was looking. So I started the masters. I know I wanted to do in motor racing. I just didn't know where to start. And then the whole big.
Was that recently, or?
Oh, this is 20 years ago now. Back in the this was back in the early to mid 90s. To any engineering undergraduate students who were listening to this, I used to use MATLAB as a DOS-based application. So that gives you an idea for the fact that I am officially across the old man.
If it's any, the only one I could match with that is I used to use Adams with a text file. So we're having like a proper geek out moment here. All these
we most certainly are. We most certainly are.
What are these two talking about?
but also too, that was the background when when active suspension had just been banned in Formula One. There was a lot of interest in vehicle dynamics. So what I did, and I sort of gravitated towards this, everything I'd done with flight dynamics and digital control based on fighter aircraft sort of morphed its way into race car vehicle dynamics. And because at that point, lap time simulation was still in its infancy, that was the birth of ChassisSim. But here's where ChassisSim took a really, really different bent to everyone else. Where lap time simulation at the time was all focused on pseudo-static simulation, we take a snapshot of the car here, we take a snapshot of the car there, we put it all together. Because of my flight dynamics and digital control and vehicle dynamics background with aerospace, I took one look at that approach for a motorsport application, and pretty much took a look at most Australian motor racing circuits, which really are basically slightly watered down rally circuits. I pretty much dismissed that approach within about 15 minutes. And that is what was the birth of the transient lap time simulation algorithm, which morphed into ChassisSim. So in 1998, I completed my master's. I had about 300 quid in my back pocket, and I did what most Australian expats do. I got on a plane to England, and I worked my way in British F3, did Formula 3000, did a year stint at the road car going division of Pi Technology, which would morph into Cosworth Electronics. Came home in 2002, thought I could get out of motor racing, but I quickly learned that motor racing is a little bit like the mafia. Once you join, you never leave. So what I then did was I pretty much dusted off ChassisSim. I started to do a bit of work with V8 supercars. One thing led to another, got involved in A1GP, and really that was sort of the commercial birth of ChassisSim. And what happened is that because of the good work that I'd done in A1GP, word gotten around, so that's when ChassisSim started to morph into other formulas such as 2, Formula 3, sports cars, and GT3 and a whole bunch of other formula, and it's been going ever since. So that's pretty much in a snapshot where is my history and where ChassisSim's come from.
For the benefit of the listeners, what is ChassisSim?
Okay, so what ChassisSim is transient vehicle dynamic simulation software that is highly tailored for the motor racing industry. There's a whole bunch.
Can you explain that in
layman's
terms?
Yeah. So what it does so in layman's terms, what it allows you to do is to model what your car's vehicle, how the car will perform on circuit. It will allow you to classify. Using the data, it will allow you to classify various aspects of the vehicle model, such as tires and aero, and then will give you a representative environment where you can run all the what-ifs through ChassisSim. So by the time you wheel the car off the trailer, you're not guessing at a setup. You already know what the setup is going to be, so that when you get to the...
So let me just clarify if I understood that correctly. So ChassisSim is a computer program that can drive a computer representation of your racing car on a particular track, and it has adjustment on it, the same as you have in your real car, so that you can start to answer the questions about, well, what spring should I run or what bar. So is that sort of roughly?
Absolutely spot on. Absolutely bang on, Samir. And if anything, to the listeners who are listening here, and I really want to make this point about what ChassisSim brings to the party. ChassisSim gives you a pretty unique 1-2-3 punch. First things first, at its core is a full multi-body, fire-breathing 21-state vehicle model that will cover everything from suspension, tire heating, the effects of aero, etc., etc. Then you can
sounds complicated.
It sounds complicated, but look, it sounds complicated, but once you actually get used to using it, it's almost become second nature. For example, my US dealer is a Japanese American by the name of John Hayes, who's actually never done an engineering degree, but he's in his late 50s. He's a grown-up race mechanic, and he's one of the best ChassisSim drivers in the world. So he's probably even better than most engineering students who'll use this, because John knows what to focus on. It's actually quite funny. John calls himself, because he lives in Atlanta, Georgia, he calls himself the Japanese hillbilly. But really, that just goes to show you that that's the technology that's underneath it. But the second punch is the fact that ChassisSim can interact with race car data to reverse engineer the key parameters of your vehicle, and particularly when it comes to race car vehicle dynamics. The two grey areas that you'll always be dealing with are tires and aerodynamics. Tires because most of what you'll get from a tire test rig result is pretty much useless. Aerodynamics, on the simple principle that most CFD and wind tunnel resources are pretty much out of the reach of about 90% of motorsport users. So you've got so ChassisSim has got that ability to take that data and to reverse engineer it, and particularly for the listeners, I know a lot of that. I know some of this sounds incredibly intimidating, but bottom line, everything that you can measure with scales and a gauge on your car is what you need to enter something into ChassisSim. Once you've got that and a good data set, ChassisSim handles the rest. And the third punch is the fact that ChassisSim will export to most data analysis software out there, which is Motec i2, Pi Toolbox, WinTax, WinDarab, AIM Race Studio Analysis, so that you can start overlaying simulated data to actual data. And once you've got that 1, 2, 3 punchability, here's the thing: once you get your head around that, you never go backwards.
I'm a bit aware that I don't want to turn it into like a Chassis Sim advert, but I love it. I love the software though. That's the problem. I can't help myself. So, but in terms of sort of taking a sort of almost a step back from the specifics of Chassis Sim, even if someone didn't necessarily want to or feel that they wanted to, use your product, what would you say would be a good starter for them? Do you think it's worth it doing anything else, or do you think really, yours is the only way?
Yeah, I know what you're trying to say, Samir. Look, at the end of the day, I mean, and I'll say this to the listeners on your podcast. It is very tempting for me to do a Fig Jam session right now, and that's if I'm good, just ask me. But on a more serious note, look, the thing about what any simulation package brings to the table, whether it be ChassisSim, whether it be any of my other competitors, is the real power of using simulation is that it forces you to really think about what drives the interaction with your car. And indeed, I often say that the lap times, the log data that you get from ChassisSim or any other simulation package to that for that matter is pretty much the full stop at the end of the process. The real value is when you're doing your validation and you're looking at the data. Hang on, why did it that much up? Then you go back and go, oh, really? I had no idea that there was a hole in the aero map. Or, wow, I had no idea that the tire slip curve went up like that and all of a sudden dropped off. And then that allows you to start start answering some very, very important questions about the race car in your mind. And ultimately, when the model is calibrated, you can say, hey, you know what? That bloke with the Caterham said, you know what? Oh, you've got to run this combination of spring and that damper. Then you go, oh, well, hang on, well, why? And then you can go through and take a look. Oh, that spring did that. Oh, really? That damper then that. Then allows you to answer some pretty fundamental questions about. About.
So how does it do that? How does that actually? How do you actually answer those questions with the simulation? Because that's a real problem.
That is a really critical problem. And that's a great question, and let me break it down for you. So, for example, let's just say that we want to evaluate the effect of a damper change. And here's one of the real questions. One key things of why ChassisSim is fully transient dynamic lap time simulation software. The only way you're going to get better than that in terms of a representative environment on the car is to run the car on the circuit. So, for example, if you do a damper change, you run that simulated change in ChassisSim, you log it to data, whether it be Motec, whether it be AIM, whether it be any other data acquisition package data acquisition package you use. You pull that into the logger, and then you start looking at that data with exactly the same techniques as you were looking at log data. So, for example, if I was doing a damper change, for instance, there are a couple of things I'd be looking at. For starters, I would be looking at what the damper histogram did. So, for example, if I was to, say, tighten up the high speed section of the damping curve, does that bring the histogram? Does that bring the histogram in when I'm hitting a curve? Does the damper response actually, does the delta damper variation drop by about 3 or 4 mils? So then you can look at that and go, so that's what that did. And of course, one of the great things about ChassisSim is that you've got like 120, 130 log channels to look at. So you can take a look at what did that do to the contact patch load variation? So, and what did that, and also too, what did, say, a spring or a bar change do to the actual transient camber? And you can go, so that's, then you can take a look and go, then you go, isn't that ever so interesting? Or the quote Captain Jack Sparrow.
Or
the quote Captain Jack Sparrow. That'd be interesting. That'd be very interesting.
Sorry.
Yeah. And the thing about it is, and here's the thing, and this is the sort of stuff that, and a colleague of mine once said to me, you know what, Danny, the worst thing and the best thing you ever did with ChassisSim at the, in the same hit was introduce a lap time at the end of it. It was the best thing because it was a transient thing that people could relate to in terms of, I make a change, was it faster or slower? It's the worst thing you could have done because all of a sudden people just get focused on the lap time. Oh, I've got to do the lap time. It's got to be slower. It's got to be lower. Where what they miss is the ability to actually treat simulated log data as if it's a proper test session. So you treat it in exactly treat it in exactly the same way. And indeed, I got to admit, I attended a lecture with one of my competitors, Chris Van Rooten from Bosch's Lap Sim. Now, Chris and I, we don't see eye to eye on much. But there are two things that we see eye to eye on. Number one, that the Pajeka model, that is the most commonly used tire model, evolved into an absolute nightmare. And a lot of that was driven because Chris studied under Professor Pajeka. And because academics are under such pressure to publish, that he just had to add more and more and more stuff to it. So you got you've got this huge trigonometric representation of the tire. And look, I got 84% pure maths free. So when it comes to maths, I know a thing or two. My first reaction when I saw a Pajeka tire model was, and I know this is a PG-13 program, was F me. It was F me. And let's put it this way, I live and breathe this stuff. So that was one area that we concurred on. But the other area that we concurred on was that you just don't look at the lap time alone. You look at the log data and you study hard what that log data is telling you, exactly the same way that you do a test session.
Can I sort of dive in there at this point and say, well, what are you looking at? So if it's not the lap time, what is it?
Okay, so this is what I look at. I'm looking at a couple of key things when I'm looking at simulated data. First things first, my first channel is I'm looking at speed. I look at throttle, I look at steer, and what I'll do is I'll quickly overlay steer to neutral steer. And what neutral steer is effectively curvature times the wheelbase.
Sorry to jump in again. One of the things that the clubman is challenged with is a lack of data channels in comparison to the professionals. So like many people listening are only running, a GPS logger, and they may not even have a pedal, or throttle. They might have throttle.
Yeah. So let me break down how you would look at the basic driver channels, and then let me walk him how you bring the simulated data to suit. So
go for it.
So again, you look at your basic driver channels, which is speed, steer, throttle, brake pressure, and lateral and longitudinal G. And then you would take a look at change to change, say, okay, what did that change do? Is there more grip? Is there less grip? Then once you've got an idea of what that is, then you start to dig into the why of why that happened. So then you would be looking at things like what the dampers were doing. Oh, okay, so I did a damper change, and now I can see, right, the oscillation of the dampers have been slightly reduced here, so I know that's going to be a good thing. And then you cross-reference that to things like what the tire load variation thing. But the big thing that also too that we've just started to introduce into the ChassisSim community is one of the channels that we export out from ChassisSim is something called stability index. And what stability index is that's the moment arm between the center of the lateral forces of the car and the center of gravity. It's basically the automotive analog of the static margin in aircraft longitudinal dynamics. And what that is that the less that number is, as that number approaches zero, the car becomes very, very quick. However, it becomes very undrivable. And indeed, most of what you'll do in race engineering is that you play a dance between the grip that's available and the minimum stability index the driver can get away with. So typically what I will do is when I'm looking at simulated data, I'll be looking at lateral G changes. Was it bigger? Was it better? But then I'll cross-reference it with the stability index and go, right, is the poor schmuck who's got to drive this thing, are they going to be able to hang on to it?
So just so you pick up on that, I think I understand what the stability index is, but I think we need a bit of a simple lesson on how that works. So you've got the center of gravity of the car.
Yep.
So that's the theoretical point about which all the forces resolve.
Yep.
And then you're saying the car is rotating around a different point. Is
No,
that what you're saying? And then the difference between those is...
let me just back up a little bit.
Go on,
The whole idea of the stability index is it revolves around the moment arm between where the center of the lateral forces are applied on the car to that, and that moment arm to the center of gravity. Let me go back of where it came from, which was aircraft longitudinal dynamics. With most aircraft, the center of lift actually isn't on the center of gravity. The center of lift is actually goes back by a certain percentage of the chord length. And so when you get a disturbance, what will happen? That center of lift will basically stabilize the vehicle. Now, ditto in a race car, the four contact patches of your tire generate for a given slip angle, for a given side slip angle, steer angle, they generate four individual wheel forces. Now, those core individual wheel forces will produce a force that's going to be offset from the center of gravity. If that's behind the center of gravity, the car is stable. So if you hit a bump, or the driver all of a sudden decides to throw in a steering input, and they let the steering wheel go, the car will naturally stabilize. However, if that moment arm is in front of the center of gravity and they give it a disturbance, what will happen is the car will swap ends, and that's when the driver comes into the pits and starts referring to you in highly negative terms with colourful language and four-letter words.
Just to sort of pick up on that, again, just for the benefit of people listening, are you talking about understeer and oversteer?
Exactly. If anything, it's really, really interesting, that concept of the whole understeer, oversteer thing that's really come into motorsport vehicle dynamics. I mean, we say, understeer, typically that's been adopted as the car being stable, and oversteer is the car being unstable. Now, that's not necessarily wrong. It's just a very, very clumsy way of putting it. But that thing between understeer and oversteer, what actually drives that, the number one driver of that, is the moment arm between the center of the lateral forces of the car and the center of the center of gravity. The closer that the closer that moment arm gets to the center of gravity is when you go from understeer to oversteer.
I understand. So the index is there, and does the theory go like this? And forgive me if I've got this wrong, but does the theory go that if you have a more unstable car, it should be quicker than a less stable car?
Precisely.
But the problem with that is you can't drive it.
Exactly. And it's so interesting you brought that up, and because a lot of people, when they look at this, now they'll look at, and this is probably the biggest trap for young players when they start playing around with simulation. The lap times get quicker and quicker and quicker. When they put it on the car is very, very difficult to drive. Now, most people at this point throw their hands up in the air and say, "This is all this is all rubbish. It's all make-believe, etc., etc." But what that actually drives to is what you've just said. The more unstable something is, the actual raw quicker itself. Like the closest analog to that is one of the biggest leaps in fighter performance design in the 1970s is when the F-16 and the F-18 were designed to be naturally unstable, to make it as agile as possible in a dogfight. And moving on from that to the F-22 Raptor, the Sukhoi 30 Flanker family series and above. Not only does it generate very quick turn rates, if you take a look at particularly the Sukhoi family, because they're unstable, that leading edge vortex actually powers the aero on the car, which leads to those really, really fantastic quick turn rates that you see. Same thing with a race car.
I think on the planes, though, just to pick up on the planes, and I think this is quite an important point. So they've made the plane unstable so that it can have more agility in the air.
Yep.
But the pilot in the same way as the car driver, the
Yep.
racing car driver, the pilot couldn't fly that plane unless it had assistance from a computer.
Exactly. All the modern fighters, from the F-16, F-18, Eurofighter, the Rafale, the Gripen, the Flanker series, the F-22, the Su-57, the J-20.
Plane geek alert, plane geek alert.
All of that. They have, yeah, I know, it's tragic. But they all have that. They all have that stability augmentation. Now, the thing about race cars is that obviously you can't have that sort of stability augmentation. And indeed, the real key thing, because I remember having this very same conversation with one of the guys who used to run Team Astromega back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And he talked about, how do we separate the race car drivers who are really good from the race car drivers who are not so good? And here's the thing that separates the Lewis Hamiltons, the Charles Leclercs, the Max Verstappens from Art Maud. The thing that separates these guys from Art Maud is that Lewis Hamilton, Max Verstappen, Charles Leclerc, Fernando Alonso et al. Can deal with very, very low values of static margin. It doesn't bother them. Where if you give that to Art Maud, or a typical race car driver who's gotten there because of money and not talent, they just can't drive it to save themselves. That's the thing that drives it.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I kind of understand that, and I think that matches up with what you might say would be sort of common understanding of what sets those guys apart, even at the elite level.
Yeah.
So dialing it down to the clubman again, who's got basically, let's say he's got an AIM Solo or a V-Box or a Motec, and he's got no other data logging input. Is there a way, but he's got a question, or she has a question about the platform, their car, the suspension, and they're thinking, I think the car is too stiff or too soft. Mm-hmm. And I've talked to people in the paddock and they say, well, I run, 350-pound springs, but you've got, based on what? And they're running an anti-roll bar and it's got this position. Mm. And they've got these dampers and they're on 3 clicks and I've got them on 5. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yep.
How do you go from that situation where the driver of the team, they want to improve their car, but they're struggling for information?
Yeah, I tell you, Samir, this is a great question, an absolute great question. And I think for me, what you've just raised is something that motor racing really, really struggles with. And the thing that you have to understand about a lot of what drives this in motor racing is that an awful lot of what drives motor racing attitudes to what you log on the car, what you shouldn't be allowed to log on the car, etc., isn't so much dictated by what makes technical or financial sense, but is pretty much dictated from a state of technophobia and from technophobia and just outright ignorance. So let's take a look at the situation of really in a perfect world, what should you be logging on a race car? Okay, so let's just say most race cars, let's just say that you're looking at an AIM Solo, a very basic Motec dash. So you've got access to lateral, longitudinal G, you've got access to steer, you've got access to throttle, you've got access to RPM, and you've got access to brake pressure, and that's pretty much it. Okay, you can pretty much, a telltale sign of when a setup works is that when you start overlaying a change to another change, you know when something's worked is when you see the C time or the lap time variance change consistently. You know it's a good change. You'll start to see the lap. The telltale sign is that you'll start to see the lap time variance all of a sudden drop off very, very consistently. That's when you know you've made a really good change. But really, one point that I want to make to any clubman racer who's listening to this is what's the debate about what channels should you log, what channels shouldn't you log? And I think part of the problem with this is that you've got two schools of thought in motor racing. You've got one school of thought that comes from the high end of the game, pretty much fueled by fueled by people who should know better, but quite frankly, pretty much infected the whole gene pool. That says that you have to run 200 channels on a car, including quadruple laser ride height sensors, free access G meters on each corner of the car, and before you know it, you've got 30 grand worth of sensors on the car. And I can tell you right now, that approach is absolute nonsense. But then you've got the flip side of it, that one of the great tragedies about motor racing is it's always had a strain of virulent technophobia that's just been burbling underneath the surface. I mean, when you go to a motor racing event, you just get, if you scratch underneath it, you'll see it right there. And some of it is actually quite nasty. That says that anything to do with simulation and data acquisition, I don't understand it. It doesn't work. I feel threatened by it, etc., etc. But if you go down into the actual raw channels that you actually need to cover you for 90% of the cases that you're ever going to need, let me walk you through them right now. They are steer, lateral G, longitudinal G. Vertical G would be nice, but you know what? You can live without it. That being said, TechSense do an excellent triaxis G meter. I think for about $800 US. That actually lasts quite a long time. Steer, throttle, brake pressure, 4 damper pots, and 4 damper pots and RPM. Everything that I have just listed in that channel list is pretty much the basis of the ChassisSim monster file. If you've got that, and that's only like 11 or 15 channels, if you've got that, you can pretty much reverse engineer things like tires and things like aero. So all of a sudden, you're not in a situation of guessing what's on the car. You now actually know, because here's the thing. If you take a look at when you install a damper pod on a car, every damper pod you install on a car is a load cell. And the great thing about dampers is that you can use that damper to reverse engineer an awful lot of what's going on with the car. Now, there are some people who think, oh, hang on, what about push rod load cells? Now, look, here's the thing about push rod load cells. Look, push rod load cells are a little bit like fish and chips in romantic movies. They either work out really, really well, or they work out really, really badly, and there's no in between. So consequently, this is one of the reasons I would say, leave load cells to your mid-formula racing and above, because they've got the resources to deal with it. But to any clubman who's listening to this, if you've got those channels I've just listed, which is lat long G, RPM, steer, throttle.
Let's flip this the other way. What could you do if you only had lat long G, speed? That was it.
You've got lat long G, speed, and throttle. You can pretty much use that for things like curvature channel. You can use it to evaluate what a change did in terms of grip. Now, look, it has its purpose and it has its place. But I would say to anyone listening, and I'm not just trying to say this from the professional side of motor racing, to try and speak to the lesser educated brethren to show them the error of their ways. I would strongly recommend to any club racer who's listening to this, let's put it this way: if you can expand to steer and 4 damper pods, and steer and 4 damper pods, and that's it, all of a sudden you've got the capability to that now gives you the capability to reverse so many aspects of what's going on with the car. Because now a lot of people look at something like that and say, "Oh shit, I can't afford that."
How much lap time is it going to give you?
I can tell you exactly what it'll give you in terms of lap time. 2 seconds. Let me give you a direct example of this. When I was
2 seconds.
Yeah. Oh yes, absolutely. Let me give you an example of this. Back in 2016, I was working with one of my Time Attack customers. Now, for any listeners here not familiar with Time Attack is a category where you've got open slather technical regulations where you can do whatever you want to to the car. So consequently, this is why you get road cars that look like the ultimate begotten love child between the Batmobile and the drag queen getting ready for Mardi Gras, because of all of the downforce and aero that you put onto the car. But the thing about it is, like, with this particular customer, they rocked up to me and said, "Look, mate, can you do a damper package for me?" And I said, "Yeah, no worries." So I had a bump profile from Eastern Creek. Came from some other log data that all it had was just all the channels that I just mentioned. I used that to reverse engineer a bump profile from the circuit. And then once we actually got to the circuit, because this car had damper pots, I was now able to look at things like, right, now I know what the aero is doing. And I could see that there was an aero imbalance with the car. And the driver was complaining, "Oh, mate, it's got understeer, 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 understeer." And pretty much the downforce was off by about 5 or 10%. And so I was looking at that, and I could see it from the damper pots in the data, and I just figured, yeah, we need to address that. Then all of a sudden, Nick turns around to me and says, "You know what, mate? We've got these front diaphragms in the car. What do you reckon?" And I said, "Well, look, mate, leave it with me." So I went through, and I knew from experience that that would address about 3 or 4% worth of aero balance. So I plugged the numbers into ChassisSim using the reverse engineered aero map that I had. Plugged it into ChassisSim, and it was like 1.7, 1.8 seconds a lap time quicker. Now, I originally took one look at that, and I said, this is simply too good to be true. And I just figured that. But then when I overlooked at the lap time, C time, the lap time variance, it was consistently quicker than everywhere. And I just figured, you know what, we've got nothing to lose. So going into the circuit, I called Nick and I just said, "Look, whack the front diaphragms on the car." So we get there. We rivet guns, drills flying everywhere, whack it in, roll the car out with 5 minutes to go. The guy goes, P10, P3. That is what you've got at your fingertips. Also, too, here's another flip side of having damper pots. Once you've got damper pots, I mean, it's a little bit like going to once you've got damper pots, all of a sudden, when you start making damper changes, all of a sudden you're not guessing. You can see what it's actually doing. Think of it a little bit like this, and I'll say this to the listener. You go to the doctor, right, and you're sick. And I'm going to give you two scenarios here. You walk in to a bloke with a stethoscope, white lab coat, thermometer, etc., takes your temperature, puts your stethoscope in, has a good listen to your chest, etc., writes you a prescription. You don't blink. You walk out there. You go to the chemist. You get the medicine. You're all better. Everyone's happy. Okay. Scenario number two. You walk into a doctor's office. There's some bloke wearing really weird ass clothing, shaking his body all over some crazy doll, etc. And he gives you something that, quite frankly, smells like warmed up arsenic. I don't know about you. I take a look at that second guy. I wouldn't give a stuff if I'm on death's door. I'd be heading out that door supersonic. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the difference between what damper pots give you and what having no damper pots give you. That's the real. That is the ultimate.
You've thought about that one before, haven't you?
I realise that right now, with everything that's going on in the world, I have to be a little bit circumspect in terms of that.
Yeah.
And, I have to be very, very circumspect in terms of my analogy. But that came from, the origin of that was that a friend of mine got this Christmas present, and I'll never forget looking at my mother going, "Oh my word! I tell you what, that must have come from the middle of the jungle somewhere," and I just shudder to think the circumstances where that came from.
So I've got a question for you. Okay.
Yep.
If because I just sort of to bring this to a close a little bit because it's been absolutely, honestly, absolutely fascinating. I really do thank you for the. I think it's a bit of a fire hose. I imagine it's a bit of a fire hose of information for people who aren't familiar with this stuff. So, well, it will be good to get your thoughts in a minute about where people can maybe find a little bit more information if they're curious,
Yep.
And that kind of thing. But my question for you is this: if you've got your racing car and it's not an aero car,
Yep.
i.e., it doesn't have a big wings and things like that.
Yep.
Where is the most lap time going to come from apart from the racing drive?
Damper setup. I can tell you that right now. It's where your lap time is.
Why do dampers? How do they work?
Yep.
And why
exactly.
do they make a difference?
Great question. This is an absolutely brilliant question. Where your time's going to come from is your damper setup, springs, bars, and geometry. That's where your lap time is. So let me give you an example. Like one of before V8 supercars subscribed to the technophobic Kool-Aid. One of the great adjustabilities in a supercar, because a supercar, look, let's face it, a V8 supercar, I can tell you right now, in terms of all of the bigger categories out there, I mean, look, with supercars, aero is the cherry on top. It doesn't do it doesn't do particularly much, and also too because of the nature of its because of the nature of its tires, you have to run really soft spring rates. So for that car, the thing that drives the setup in that car, it's all about dampers, and it's dampers, geometry. So it's dampers and geometry. That's the thing that drives the setup of a V8 supercar. But for most other people, it's because here's the thing: if you're really intelligent about what you do with the damper, and it's really interesting. If we take a look at the modern race car damper, where it evolved from is that in the early 90s, you had the whole drive to active, and a lot of very, very important lessons were learnt about that drive to active. Then the FIA did what the FIA did. They panicked and decided to ban it. But because so much had been learnt, that was the origin of the digressive curve, where you have a very, very high low speed section with a very, very soft high-speed section, and there's a lot of time to be gained in appropriately tuning that, but also too matching that to your geometry, matching that to what the spring is doing. So that is how you tune a non-aero car. And
so I would say that would be most people listening would go, yeah, kind of get that. So where's the simulation? Where does that come into it?
Where the simulation comes in is that you can load all that into ChassisSim, run through all the what ifs, and see what the dampers are going to do, and see what all those.
Sorry, Danny. When you say what ifs, you mean
all the different damper adjustments, geometry adjustments, etc., etc.
I think dampers are a little bit sort of voodoo, but springs people kind of get. Yeah, so I've got a box of springs with different rates. So you can put those different rates in and you can see the car perform differently.
Precisely. And also, too, for those of you who think that dampers basically is all voodoo and it can only be solved by some crazy witch doctor, shaking various body bits around a damper to come up with a damper setup, I can tell you right now, that's complete nonsense. And to anyone listening to this, so much, I mean, and this is one of my perpetual frustrations with motor racing is that there's an attitude in motor racing, I don't understand it, it's voodoo, I'm scared, I don't touch it. I can tell you right now, that's a complete nonsense. When you have something you don't understand, go off and research it. It's really funny. A lot of people are convinced that I was born solving 10th order differential equations when I was cracking myself in my nappies. I can tell you right now, that's a complete nonsense. I was born with a truckload of food allergies that slowed my intellectual development. The only reason that I've gotten to where I've gotten is not because I'm bright. Once you've gone through and worked through a million examples of how to resolve a differential equation, how to resolve this, etc., etc. When you apply yourself, when you do your homework, the results will come. To everyone who's listening, if you don't understand something, ask. That's what people like Samir are here for. This is what people like myself. Do not hesitate in asking me your questions, because you would not believe some of the shockers I get in my inbox on a day-to-day basis from people who should know a hell of a lot better.
That's very comforting. Thank you for that one. I've got a question. Because just to wrap it up now. So say someone is curious now. You've said all this stuff, and they've listened to the show, and they've gone, I'm intrigued. I want to give that a go. I'm going to go and do some research. I want to do my own learning. What can they do, and how can they get access? Because it sounds pretty expensive to me.
Actually, it isn't. We've got the great thing about ChassisSim is that we've got pretty much something for everyone, from your club racer right through to your F1 team. So for your club racer, your natural entry point for ChassisSim is ChassisSim Online. Now, it's pretty much $5 a sim. So that's for the club racer, that's a great start point. Get stuck on anything, look, ask. Don't suffer in silence. Help is never that far away.
Danny, thank you so much. It's been overwhelming a little bit, but I knew it would be. I knew the passion and the love for your subject and your industry would come through, and it really, really has. I think if people have picked up 2 or 3 things there: the importance of dampers, the importance of getting some data acquisition on your race car, the opportunity that if you put those types of sensors on the car, you could start to dip into the world of simulation, be it ChassisSim or another product. Obviously, I love ChassisSim, but there are other products that are available, and that's hopefully given people a little bit of confidence and a little bit of insight to start to look at this and think, well, okay, this is how the professionals are doing it, and this is why. And you know what? We might be able to get some performance here just by being a bit smarter, but we don't have to know all the differential equations ourselves. Danny's done that, and we can just put in our numbers, and we interpret it in the way in which his videos kind of guide us, then maybe we can go get some performance.
Absolutely. If I made it, any other schmuck can make it.
Well, that's a lovely way to end. I think the message there is you're trying to teach people how to fish, I suppose, rather than giving them fish.
Precisely.
Yeah, that's the nice one, and that's really that really, to be honest, that really aligns with what I'm trying to do with your data driven in the sense of trying to help people help themselves.
Copy that.
Okay, well, thank you. It's been a real honour and a pleasure to have you on the show. I really appreciate your time.
And Samir, thank you so much for having me. I do appreciate it.
So how was that? Possibly a bit intimidating at times with some of the technical jargon, but I really hope you can feel the passion that Danny has for trying to help racers improve their car setup and ultimately go faster. His software and others like it are something that's not really used at a club level, and potentially that's something that you could start to use to give yourself a bit more of an advantage over your competitors, be that on the track or even on the sim. Hope you enjoyed it, and catch you next time. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and visit us at yourdatadriven.com.